Welcome to the Living in the Future podcast, where we bring to light specialized topics from life in the modern age. I'm talking to Tom DeRose, research manager for the Freud Museum London, the final home of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, and his daughter Anna Freud, a pioneering child psychoanalyst. How did Freud happen to come to London?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of quite a long story, but quite a tragic story as well. Of course, Freud had lived for pretty much all of his life, apart from the early few years in Vienna. Freud lived in Bergasse 19 in an apartment in Vienna with his family, and it was also the center of the psychoanalytic publishing house, and so it was really the kind of core center for psychoanalysis. But of course, when the Anschluss in March 1938 took place, when Germany invaded Austria, things became very difficult for Jews in Vienna. And of course, Freud was Jewish. I mean, he had experienced a great deal of anti-Semitism throughout his life. Since 1897, Austria had an anti-Semitic mayor who died in 1910, Karl Lueger. So it was a kind of notoriously quite an anti-Semitic city, but nothing on the kind of level of anti-Semitism that was to come after the Anschluss. So very quickly after the Anschluss in March, a few days later, the psychoanalytic publishing house was raided by the Nazis, and kind of the books were being destroyed. And his daughter, Anna Freud, then went into questioning with the Gestapo a couple of weeks after that, which really kind of propelled Freud into seeking to leave Vienna. Many people had kind of encouraged him and suggested that he should leave. You know, that it wasn't looking good, of course, in Germany and Austria at the time. But as an old man, and as a man who was kind of very stuck in his ways and very kind of ruled by habit in a way, he really needed something extreme to happen to force him to leave. And it was very difficult to get out as well for Jews in Austria at the time, in Vienna particularly. So what happened is he, through diplomatic pressure, through his friend Princess Marie Bonaparte, and from significant pressure as well from the American ambassador to Austria, William Bullitt, letters from President Roosevelt himself, and pressure from the UK, the British government, Freud was eventually kind of allowed to leave and was given 16 exit visas for his close family, his housemaid, and various other people, his doctor. It was a very arduous process, and he, a very kind of humiliating process, a huge amount of documentation, a huge amount of things needing to be signed, and the Reichstax, the payment of a certain amount of money to the Nazi government. But eventually he was able to leave in June 38. They got a train to Paris and stayed over in Paris with Princess Marie Bonaparte at her place just outside of Paris, and then travelled on to London from there. So they arrived in June 1938. So that's the kind of broad circumstances around Freud leaving Vienna, Freud and the family leaving Vienna and ending up in London.
What happened to the Vienna offices?
To the Vienna office, to Freud's apartment in Vienna?
Yes.
Yeah, well, tragically, it's overtaken. It was appropriated by the Nazis, by the government, and then it became, for a time, a holding centre for Jewish families. I mean, many of these apartments in Vienna became these kind of holding centres for Jewish families who were kind of, I guess, kind of quarantined, hemmed in to these apartments, collected there for processing. And then were later on, of course, tragically sent, many of them, to death camps. So so it became appropriated by the government. And actually, in the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna now, that's been fairly recently renovated. has had a big kind of curatorial makeover. They have a list on the wall going down the stairs of all of the Jewish occupants, people who were forcibly stationed there after Freud had left, and then what happened to them basically, and obviously a vast percentage of them ended up dying in death camps. So yeah, a really kind of tragic story for the place where Freud had lived all his life, pretty much. Well, a good part of his professional life at least, and the family had been. It's a very harrowing kind of story of that building, really.
So there's a museum there now. What possessions do they have versus you have, I guess?
Right. Yeah. So the museum itself in Vienna was set up in the early 70s, I think 1971, if I'm correct. So yeah, in the early 70s. And when it was set up, it was all of Freud's collection, of course, came over to London. And of course, we can talk about how that happened a bit later, if you like. But Anna Freud, who was still living in the house in 20 Maresfield Gardens, where the Freud Museum London now is, was contacted by the people who were setting up the museum, and she sent a small selection of artifacts and books and various other bits and pieces to Vienna, so there would be some physical objects in the space when it was opened. But of course, the vast majority of the material of Freud's possessions, of his objects, his books, even the bookcases and furniture themselves, came to London and are still there. So I think in Vienna you have the kind of the physical building that you associate with Freud, the bricks and mortar, really, those kind of lovely Viennese staircases and the consulting room and where Freud's famous patients were treated and where kind of psychoanalysis really came into life, to be honest. And but in London, of course, you have the collection. So they're
Sure.
quite different spaces, yeah.
How long did Freud live at the house in London?
Well, he lived there for about a year. So when Freud arrived in London, he didn't move into 20 Maresfield Gardens straight away. So the house had been kind of purchased, but there was quite some work that needed to be done to it. So Freud's son, Ernst Freud, was a modernist architect. And he made a number of changes to the fabric of the house. So he built a beautiful kind of loggia out the back of the house, and he installed a lift for Freud to use because the stairs had become increasingly difficult for him. Various other changes that were made to the house. So when Freud first arrived in London, he stayed in a house in Ellsworthy Road, which is about a 15-minute walk from the museum now, while Maresfield Gardens was being adapted for him, and being set up with his collection being put into place and everything. They moved in early September 1938, and of course Freud died on the 23rd of September 1939. So it's pretty much a year he was in the actual house at Maresfield Gardens for.
Who arranged the things the way they are now?
You mean the kind of artifacts and
the artifacts, the house, the rooms, the furniture, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean the core part of the house is, of course, as you'll know, Don, if you've been to London and seen the museum, is the study, and that's where Freud's collection of antiquities is. So that there was about 2,500 pieces in the collection overall. And so it was mainly Freud's housekeeper, Paula Fichtel, who's quite a remarkable woman, really, who'd been with the Freud family for many years in Vienna, was a very kind of faithful housekeeper, very attached to them. She had an incredible memory, and kind of remembered, where the pieces were supposed to be. So the idea was to kind of replicate the two rooms in Vienna. So there's two rooms that were, one was Freud's where the couch was, and the other was a kind of where the desk space was, so the consulting room. In London, it's one room, it's one big room, but the kind of model is the same. So the idea was to kind of replicate as close as possible the study from Vienna to London. But of course, what's quite interesting as well is that you'll notice if you look at the way that that it looked in Vienna to London. So just to clarify, there was there's some wonderful black and white photos that were taken in Vienna by a photographer called Engelmann, who was asked to kind of visually record, the study and Freud's living spaces, with the thought that he would be leaving from Vienna soon. So they wanted to capture a kind of visual document of what things looked like there. And the Gestapo were watching the apartments outside, so he wasn't able to use flash. So it was all kind of taken on this kind of rudimentary camera. But they have this wonderful kind of ghostly, evocative impression, these photographs. And you can see what the Vienna apartment looked like then. So we know where everything was. When they got to London, those photographs hadn't been developed yet. So they weren't able to use that as photographic kind of, just have a look at the photo and arrange things as it was kind of thing. But Paolo Fichte's memory, I think, and work with the family that came, pretty much brought things back to how they were. But there are some clear changes, some very obvious changes that were made. So, for example, in Vienna, over Freud's famous couch, there was a painting of Abu Simbel in Egypt, the tomb. Now, in London, we have a kind of a lithograph of Jean-Martin Charcot teaching at the Salpêtrière, a lesson on hysteria. And there were a number of similar changes like that. So Freud was a kind of curator, I think, of his own space as well as a collector.
Okay. You have an exhibit coming up in which you're going to detail the relationship between various artifacts, and people can go online and actually see the office as it is now. There are photos, and the relationship between those artifacts and development of various psychoanalytic concepts. Could you talk about what will be in the exhibit and some of the concepts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, first of all, I mean, the exhibition's entitled kind of Freud's Antiquity, Object, Idea, Desire. And as you mentioned, the idea behind the exhibition really is to bring some of Freud's theories into dialogue with some of the objects from his collection. And just to see kind of how they speak to each other, really, how theory and object can interrelate. Freud, from very early on, throughout Freud's career, he often talked about the idea that a psychoanalyst is a little bit like an archaeologist. So he drew this analogy between psychoanalysis and archaeology. Really, in that kind of an archaeologist doesn't take what they see on the ground at face value. They dig into the earth, and by digging, you start to kind of uncover truths and treasure and stuff. And Freud kind of drew this parallel with psychoanalysis, because for him, psychoanalysis is not about kind of cataloguing symptoms, the things that you see, with mental health issues, whatever the symptom might be. But it's about kind of digging into the mind and finding the causes for those symptoms. And Freud changes throughout his career the way he thinks about the relationship between archaeology and psychoanalysis. But the parallel, it does run through his thinking, this analogy. So that's one of the first kind of key concepts that we want to elaborate on in this exhibition, this link between archaeology and psychoanalysis. And we do that across kind of 6 different themes throughout the exhibition. So what we wanted to do was focus on 6 kind of moments in Freud's career, or 6 kind of key topics, really. and then kind of develop on, bring objects into dialogue with each of those topics. So, for example, the Oedipus complex, the famous kind of Oedipus complex that Freud, I guess, is probably most famous for now, elaborating the notion of an Oedipus complex. So we've taken Freud had an etching, a small print of the Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres's Oedipus and Sphinx painting. In Vienna he had this by the couch. In London it's by the window. So we've brought that out on display, as well as a Greek kind of water jug, a hydria, which has a kind of a beautiful painting of Oedipus confronting the Sphinx in this famous moment where Oedipus solves the riddle of the Sphinx. And we've brought that together with the kind of theory of Oedipus, and where Freud comes up with this notion of the Oedipus complex, why Oedipus was such an important figure historically at the time in kind of German thinking, and also really to think about what these objects can tell us about who Oedipus was, and what was the riddle, and why there are many different solutions to this riddle. So that's kind of one example of a theory and some objects that kind of we're looking to interrelate. And as I said, there are 6 different kind of stations where we do that with representative objects and theories.
And the exhibit will also be online, right? So people...
Right.
And you have a basic catalog up now with some of the artifacts. Mm-hmm. From what I've read, you're going to expand that catalog. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So so to answer your first question about the digital, the online thing. So part of I was talking to you about this archaeological metaphor. Yeah, this archaeological analogy, and the idea of digging into something to find more resource, more meaning, whatever it might be. So the idea is that we have a physical exhibition, but we also have a digital archive, which is almost like the stuff that you can dig into to find out more about what's going on with this particular topic. So and each of these topics has a digital resource that contains a video, a podcast, some rotating images of the objects on display, and kind of further reading and explanatory material. So it's a really kind of rich and resource, kind of multimedia resource, that for anyone who wants to really get under the surface of some of this theory and how the object and theory relate to each other, that is a really going to be a really powerful kind of tool. And so to your second point, Don, there'll be kind of 27 objects in the exhibition itself, and each of those objects will be elaborated on and described within both the digital archive and a catalogue that we're writing up specifically for the exhibition. So basically it works out that each of these each of the 6 topics has between 3 and 5 objects that represent that theory kind of thing.
What are some of the other topics beside the Oedipal complex?
So it goes through. So the first is the Freud's relationship to Charcot, the famous French neurologist, and Freud studied in Paris under Charcot in 1885. And Charcot was treating kind of hysteria at the Salpêtrière in Paris. So we're looking at Freud's relationship to Charcot and thinking about how Freud moved away from a kind of iconography of symptoms and started thinking about kind of archaeology through his relationship to Charcot. So that's the first point. Then we have the Oedipus complex, of course, which I've just kind of described. We have another topic on dreams. Of course, Freud's most famous work probably is the interpretation of dreams. So we have some objects, some Etruscan objects on display there, and Freud was collecting Etruscan objects, particularly after a trip to Orvieto in 1897, just before he was writing the interpretation of dreams. So we're using some objects around dreams. We have another topic on Gradiva, and Gradiva was a novel that Freud wrote an analysis of in 1907. So, and he brought a kind of bas relief of this walking woman, you know, the original of which is in the Vatican museums in Rome. So we have something on Gradiva, and then we go a bit further on in Freud's career to kind of 1913, when he wrote the work Totem and Taboo, and we have his complete set of James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, which was one of the works that he drew heavily on in Totem and Taboo. And the final topic, the final station, is on Moses, on Moses, and particularly on Moses and monotheism, his final work. And to talk about Moses, the main object in that is the family Bible, the Philipson Bible, as it's known. Which is a kind of beautiful, oversized, kind of very well illustrated and annotated version of the Bible, which was in both in Hebrew and in German. So it's almost like an encyclopedia, really, that Freud kind of, you know, talks about in his autobiography, in one of his autobiographies, of something that had a real influence on him when he was younger, reading the Philipson Bible. You know, so that's the that's the final point. So Freud and Moses and the Bible.
Does he have any artifacts from the Akhenaten period of Egypt to go along with Moses and monotheism?
Yeah, there is a sculpture, a small kind of bronze piece of Amun-Re from it's not from the Akhenaten period, but it's representing Amun-Re from that period. So I think it's a little later than the period itself. But it's, you know, in that kind of that is there as a kind of representative of the kind of that syncretic divinity Amun-Re. So
has anybody done a total inventory of all the artifacts and maybe not origins, but maybe authenticity or just validity and, you know, a cataloging of everything?
Most of it, I think that on a rudimentary scale, yeah, that has kind of taken place. I mean, when we became a museum in 1986, there was a kind of big audit of Freud's collection. Much of it is, I mean, Freud, I think he was quite fortunate in a way when he was collecting, because much of the collection is kind of original and genuine. There are one or two forgeries. I guess that's probably where we wanted to go with this, really. So,
not to focus on the forgeries, but just right. I couldn't. I had to assume there must have been one or two, and just the interest of the sum of the total collection and what it means, and just an analysis of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I was saying, I mean, Freud, the collection is of kind of it's a good quality collection. I mean, that's the opinion of experts in the field. You know, it's a better than average kind of collection in the fact that most of it, as I said, is kind of authentic and original. I mean, Freud he had some very good friends. So, you know, he was friends with the curator at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, Dr. Julius Banco, who authenticated, you know, some of his more important pieces. So we still have the authentication notes that Banco drew up. You know, as I mentioned, one of the objects in the exhibition is this kind of water jug, this represents Oedipus and the Sphinx, very beautiful kind of Greek hydria from kind of, you know, high period in Athens. And that we have an authentication note from for that particular object, and dozens of others. So, and he also had a very good friend who was a very well respected art historian, archaeologist called Emmanuel Loewy, who had been a long-term friend of his who was an expert in antiquities. So I think if he was looking to purchase something, he had people there to kind of to verify things for him and to give him advice. Um, he had a good eye himself as well, I think, but there were, of course, things that slipped through the net. So, for example, there's a really lovely kind of wooden falcon-headed figure that you may have seen when you were here. It's quite a large piece, and if you're going into the study as you turn left, it's on the left-hand side in a cabinet. You wouldn't necessarily notice it unless you were looking for it, but that, for example, is a 19th century forgery. And there are others dotted around, but I think, you know, it was a strange time, really. I mean, after Heinrich Schliemann and Arthur Evans, you know, had kind of discovered, as it were, Troy and Mycenae, which were obviously not what they had thought they were. After that, you know, there was this proliferation of antiquities and stuff on the market, you know, and you could pick things up in junk shops and as well as antique shops, but of course that also encourages kind of you know, this kind of all of these replicas being produced as well. But I think I mean, it looks as if from the audits that have been done that Freud was, you know, pretty fortunate or you know, pretty wise in his choice of pieces.
Has anybody done an analysis of what the collection is? Mostly figures, mostly human figures, mostly animal figures. What countries? Is it mostly Egypt, mostly Greece, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, there has been a fair amount of a few publications on Freud's collection that talk about the kind of so I mean, as far as origin goes, most of it's obviously from Egypt, Greece, and Rome. There are some other pieces that are quite interesting. You know, there's certain pieces from kind of Bali, from Indonesia. There are pieces from Mesoamerica. There are, you know, so there's some Iranian Luristan shapes. So there are quite a few of, you know, different kind of representations of different areas of kind of Syrian, you know, Mesopotamian votive offering, which is going to be to Ishtar, which is also going to be in the exhibition. So there is a kind of, you know, it's not solely kind of Greek, Egyptian, Roman, but that takes up the majority of the collection. I think I'm talking off the top of my head, actually, quite anecdotally here, but I would say that the major, you know, there are quite a number of figurines and vases, you know, that's the kind of main thing. But I wouldn't be able to comment on the kind of specifics of, you know, the categories of the collection. It's quite a wide-ranging collection. You know, there's also kind of tablets with hieroglyphs and fresco pieces of you know, of mosaic and things. So it's quite a Catholic with a small c collection in a way. But of course the other thing that's interesting about Freud is his library as well that came over from Vienna, you know, and even his very bookcases themselves came over from Vienna. So I mean, we're very fortunate in the fact that in the museum we have Freud's books on the shelves, and you know, there are more, as he said himself, he'd read more on archaeology than he had on psychology. So you know, you can see that this is a abiding passion for him, you know, and something that you know is a very, very important part of his life. And I guess, you know, the last point on that is something that's very curious that I've often wondered about, is the fact that all of these objects, they're only in his workspace. You know, so they're only in the study. There's all these, you know, a couple of thousand objects or so, all in the study, but not in his living spaces, not in his bedroom, not in the dining room, nowhere like that. And it was the same in Vienna. So they were obviously very important for what was going on in the analytic session, in the workplace, in the place where Freud was working. I think that's quite a remarkable thing, really.
The books are in the living space, right?
Well, the study in Maresfield Gardens that we have now is a bit different to where to how things were in Vienna. So
Okay.
that area now is all, would have been where Freud was practicing. So his bedroom was upstairs. It's the only part of the house that we have now in London which is as it was back then, basically. But it's primarily a workspace. And if you think, when Freud was only seeing 4 patients in London, he was a very old man. He was very afflicted. He had cancer of the jaw. He was in the last stages of his life. And towards the end of his life, he had a bed made up in the study. So it became, so then the personal space and the kind of workspace kind of conjoined. But throughout his life, he was either treating patients or writing, in the majority of his time. But there's really a clear, even though you think someone like Freud wasn't really ever switched off from work, I guess, but there is a kind of clear statement, I think, in that the fact of this area is where we do psychoanalysis. This is where all of the collection is, this is where the books are and stuff. And the rest of the house it doesn't happen there.
Sort of the archaeology to help with the archaeology, if something like that.
Well, I think so. I mean, you have accounts from some of his patients, like the poet H.D., who talks about, Freud, using, these objects helping him to stabilize his thought almost. So, and also the way that he illustrates things to his patients by referring to the objects. So, for example, Freud's famous patient, the Rat Man, Freud talks to Pompeii about Pompeii to him, and he says, look at the objects on this desk. When they're in the ground, when they're buried, they're like the unconscious. They're preserved. Nothing's disturbing them. As soon as they're brought out into the open, as soon as, by analogy, as soon as these things become conscious, then, they start to become worn away. So they start to physically deteriorate. So, and then he uses this lovely phrase that, Pompeii, the destruction of Pompeii only really occurred after it was dug up, you see. So you can see throughout his work that he's continually deploying, these things on the desk, these things on the walls, these objects, these gods, to help kind of explain or kind of maybe not even explain, but to help capture the imagination almost of, the person on the couch, to start the sparks of thought, perhaps.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I don't think many people are, when they think of psychoanalysis, I don't think they think of ancient artifacts as guide points.
Well, I mean, can I just come in there, actually, Don?
Sure.
It's interesting you say that, because, you think nowadays of that classic kind of New York apartment, where you do analysis, or in England, in kind of on the NHS, whatever, you think of a white cube, don't you? A doctor's space, where you think of, you don't want anything that's going to distract from the patient's free association. Yeah. You don't want anything that's going to get in the way of their personal material and stuff. But yeah, you go into the study in Freud's room, it's surrounded by antiquities, and then you start to think Freud has this imperative to say whatever comes to your head, free associate, and it should all be coming from inside you. It should all just be, and it should be, you shouldn't be scared of saying something, just let it out, kind of thing. However it comes out is great. But also that you almost feel like these things around him, these objects as well, are also trying to help somehow that process, I think. It's a really interesting idea. And is it helping Freud? Is it helping the patient? Is it, what are they there for? You can't ignore the fact that they're there, and they're clearly taking an active role in the work.
It's almost like, and I hope this isn't too much of a stretch, but like a ritual space.
Well, I mean, you think of the analytic hour. Yeah, I mean, there are certain rituals that go on. I think that's there are set formulas that you go through, aren't there? You lay in a certain space, you talk in a sort of way. Perhaps they do help create that sense of kind of ritual. I mean, there's a sense of kind of deep time, isn't there? I guess, and deep past, in those kind of antiquities, and I guess that you might think about going back and thinking about, the early ages, things that have happened to you, perhaps. They're certainly there for a reason, and they certainly help the process, from whichever position. So yeah, I think the idea of ritual is quite an important one in psychoanalysis. There's even Freud writes papers on the kind of technique of psychoanalysis and that kind of, and you sometimes feel it is a kind of contemporary ritual, really.
The museum isn't just dedicated to Freud. It's also has exhibits from other family members. When I was there was a Lucian Freud exhibit.
Yeah.
There's also rooms dedicated to Anna Freud. Can you talk about what areas are dedicated to other family members? And
I mean, I think the thing that we, as a Freud museum, we describe ourselves as the final home of Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna Freud, who was a pioneering child psychoanalyst. And I think that, I think Anna Freud is a kind of representative of the Freud family, really the person that she was so important for Freud, cared for him, was his youngest daughter, and also in a way kind of carried on the kind of tradition of psychoanalysis in a specific way. She became, as I said, a child psychoanalyst and an educator. So she really carried on psychoanalysis, and she lived there, of course, until she died in 1982. So we have, when Anna died, she left in her will the desire that the house would be turned into a museum dedicated to her father. But of course, we have, specific spaces dedicated to the life and work of Anna Freud, celebrating her importance in that story, really. We also have, we're one of the few buildings in London to have two blue plaques on the front of the house. So like a blue plaque in London, I'm sure you know this, but you see these houses, for people, listeners who haven't seen this before in the UK, you often see these blue plaques on houses where famous people lived, So we have one, of course, for Sigmund Freud, but on our front, on the front of the house, but we also have one for Anna Freud. So, and I think that's really testament to the importance of Anna Freud in the story, not just of psychoanalysis and that familial story of Freud and his, him coming to London, but also in the history of the house and in the history of the life and the heartbeat of kind of psychoanalysis in that area. Because Anna Freud also practiced, she had a kind of nursery down the road from Maresfield Gardens that then became the Anna Freud Centre, which has since moved to King's Cross. So she had a really important kind of role in that area and in the house, and of course as Freud's daughter. So I think Anna is the key. We also talk about, some of, Freud's wife, of course, Martha, and his sister-in-law Minna, who both lived here after Freud had died in 1939. Dorothy Burlingham, who was Anna's companion. So there's many stories that go on beyond just, the patriarch of the house, Sigmund. Lucian Freud, of course, was one of, died fairly recently, the great artist. It was a centenary exhibition. We've recently had an exhibition on Lucian, which has just finished. But I think it's important to say that the Freud family are not directly now involved in the running of the house. And also we're run by a board of trustees. We're also an independent charity. So unlike the museum in Vienna, we're not state funded. So we don't get funds from the UK government. We're an independent charity. So whilst we do have relations with the living descendants of Freud, they don't have an active involvement per se in the house itself, apart from the fact that Lord David Freud is the museum's president. So So yes, it's we don't just like to, we're not just a house about Sigmund. We also think about about Anna, the family, and of course the legacy of psychoanalysis itself.
What other programs do you have besides the museum? I understand you have education programs. There's a Lacan lecture coming up, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a wide range of programs that are run through the exhibition, through the museum. So um, we have an education program, as you mentioned. So we have school groups, university groups, postgraduate groups, and public groups who can come in and have kind of specific kind of tours and lectures, bespoke programs for different groups like that. We have a thriving kind of public program. You mentioned a kind of a Lacanian lecture. We have we have a kind of we cover a broad range of theoretical positions, really, in the way that we engage with psychoanalysis today. So part of it is kind of, from that Freudian tradition and thinking about that, Freud's influence, but also about kind of psychoanalysis today and thinking about the different ways in which different schools of psychoanalysis engage with Freud's ideas and how clinical practice might differ in certain ways. So, you mentioned Lacan and also, of course, Melanie Klein and Anna Freud and Winnicott. All of these important figures in the history of psychoanalysis. We tend to keep we're quite a broad church in that way. So we're not affiliated to a particular theoretical position in the field of psychoanalysis, but we see ourselves as a kind of educational disseminator and a place for discussion, really, for different positions. So we also have a thriving kind of membership scheme. So we have lots of events specifically for members. We're a site for private hire, and I'm trying to think what else. Lots of things go on. God, there's loads of things. I can hardly remember them. Conferences, courses, podcasts, symposia, you name it, we do it, basically.
When will the new exhibit reach, and where can people find information about it?
Right, well, the new exhibit is opening on the 25th of February. It's running till the 16th of July. So it's a fairly good long period of time. You can find out about it on our website, www.freud.org.uk. As I mentioned, there is a physical exhibition that you can, which would be great to come and see some of these objects in their materiality. And also kind of engage with the house itself. But we're also mindful of the fact that not everyone can get to London in the next 5 months. So we have this comprehensive digital archive that we're working on at the moment and that will be released at the same time. So that's, again, the 25th of February, just in a few weeks now. So I suggest for people to do check out our website for further updates and stuff, and all of the digital archive material will also be available free of charge as well for people. So that's as I said, podcasts, videos, texts, rotating photographs that really kind of attempt to kind of get under the skin and get under the build up those connections, those quite surprising connections, as you said, Don, between that the kind of archaeology and those figurines and the development of the concepts and methods of psychoanalysis. It's a surprising analogy, it's a surprising connection, but I think that once people start kind of burrowing into it a bit, it starts to make sense, really, why Freud would be so would have that kind of connection to archaeology.
Thank you very much, and it's been wonderful talking to you.
You're very welcome, Don. Cheers. Thank you.